Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. Today, my guest is David Yamane. He is a professor of sociology at Wake Forest University. For the first 20 years of his career, he focused on the sociology of religion. But since 2011, Professor Yamane has been interested in the sociology of guns, since, as he once explained, there is no sociology of US gun culture. He currently studies the shift of gun culture in America to what he calls gun culture 2.0. And he writes two blogs on guns in America. One is called Gun Culture 2.0, and the other is called Gun Curious. And he has a book about gun culture 2.0 that is forthcoming. Professor Yamane, thank you so much for joining me remotely today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you both.
And co-hosting the show with me is my friend Sebastian. He's a freshman on the team and led the research for Professor Yamane's interview. Sebastian, thanks so much for joining me for your first interview.
Hey, thank you, Tiger.
So Professor Yamane, why don't we just get started? So you've described the current state of gun research as overly epidemiological, overly criminological, and as a missed opportunity. What drove you to study the sociology of guns, and how does your research differ from others studying guns today?
Yeah, so I was a sociologist of religion for a long time, kind of got burnt out a little bit after my last book, and I was at a kind of new stage of my career, and I thought I need a new topic to study. And I realized in my 40s, when I was in North Carolina, that guns seemed to be all around me. It wasn't unusual for lots of different people I knew, regardless of what their professional or educational background were, to have some involvement with guns, which really surprised me given my background growing up in California, where there wasn't much of an active gun culture. And then a kind of blue bubble followed me through graduate school and into my professional life. So, when I decided I wanted to study guns as my new project, I thought, well, I want to understand why it is that guns are so normal for this group of people, which was very different from my own background. And so, as I got into the scholarly literature, I realized that nobody was really studying the normality of guns for these people, that everybody was either studying the criminal use of guns or the negative outcomes that come with guns, which, would include, uh, homicide, suicide, and other injuries. And I was sort of surprised that there wasn't a literature, given how long-standing American gun culture is, given the huge number of Americans who own guns, and given the large number of guns there are. So, that's where I talked about there not really being a sociology of guns, in the sense that there wasn't a body of literature that really understood why guns are normal for a large swath of the American population.
And this is what you call gun culture, right?
Yeah, so gun culture is, there are many different cultures within the United States, having to do with beliefs, values, norms, knowledge around different areas of social life. And so I thought, if there is a gun culture in the United States, we want to understand the beliefs, values, norms, and behaviors around guns. And, again, in terms of the legal sort of lawful use of firearms, and not just the criminal and harmful uses of firearms.
And as far as you can tell, is gun culture a uniquely American phenomenon?
I think that the United States definitely is one of the rare countries in the world that has a robust lawful gun culture. And I think we could think about and potentially distinguish sort of criminal cultures that revolve around guns. But in terms of having a robust lawful culture of guns, the United States is somewhat unique in that, as a going all the way back into the colonial era, guns were an important part of life on the frontier, the entire colonial experience being a frontier experience, and then with the westward expansion. And so the practical reality of guns was there from the start. They were commonly owned. And then with the expansion of the country, the guns expanded, and then became part of American identity in terms of its association with, that early colonial and early Republican era of the country.
And earlier you mentioned that the the perspectives on guns that you saw growing up in California, being in academic environments, were very different from what you saw in North Carolina. And right now you just talked about westward expansion and sort of the frontier. Is there a reason why gun culture and perspective on guns are so different in different parts of the country?
Yeah, I think that this has something to do with the sort of urban versus rural experiences, as well as the kind of cosmopolitanism that comes along with living in more urban areas on the coast. And so a lot of times, it's just not seen to be the right thing or the proper thing to be involved with guns. There's such a strong stereotype of gun owners as being, kind of rednecks who, live in trailers out in rural parts of the country. And so, I think that some of it is the fact that people simply don't own as many guns and they don't have as much experience with guns. And then I think there's another element of it that in certain places the guns are so stigmatized that even people who have guns aren't very public about it. So, I think now, since people know me as a gun scholar who, doesn't judge people for, their gun ownership, people are kind of coming out of the closet to me all the time about their, either ownership of or interest in firearms, including someone I just, spoke to the other day who said, I'm the last person I would, people would think would be interested in guns, a liberal Jewish professor from Long Island. And yet I'm really interested in, going to the range. And if you ever have the opportunity to take me, that would be amazing. So, I think that at some aspect of the lack of a gun culture in certain areas, has to do with the stigmas associated with guns, and those stigmas have to do with some of the people who people think are gun people.
Sebastian, behind those two doors, he actually has a lot of AR-15s.
Wow, the Princeton is much more liberal towards guns than I thought they were.
I'm just kidding, but Professor Yamada, there's a very interesting both YouTube video and article on the Gun Culture 2.0 site that caught my attention when I first read it, which is that you wrote how a card-carrying liberal professor became a card-carrying liberal armed American, and you talked about your own transformation, which is also very much associated with this transition from gun culture 1.0 to 2.0. So I suppose I'll try to mix both questions to you at the same time. How did you change, and also how did the 1.0 change from 2.0? How are they different?
Yeah. So I'm one of those 20% of gun owners who self-identifies as a liberal, and this going all the way back into the 1980s and democratic politics, where Michael Dukakis was accused of being a card-carrying liberal, as if this was some sort of, what worse thing could someone possibly call you? And so, we adopted the card-carrying liberal idea as being, a kind of badge of honor. So, I've been involved in liberal and democratic politics my whole life, and the fact that I then came into gun ownership doesn't really fundamentally shift that aspect of my self-identity. But part of the reason that I got involved with guns personally, in addition to as a scholar, was out of concern for my own and my family's protection. There, I talk in that video and in that essay about a disturbing experience I had at my apartment complex. I won't go into it much further than that, but so that defensive aspect of gun ownership was something that really helped my development as a gun owner. And as a sociologist, I reflected on that personal change and realized that it actually is part of this broader cultural change in emphases of gun culture from hunting and recreational shooting, which is what we call gun culture 1.0, to more personal protection and self-defense oriented culture, which is what we call gun culture 2.0, which is, I think, the center of gravity today of gun culture. So, if the sociological perspective really wants to understand the intersections of biography and history within society. And so, I can't think of myself as outside of those same basic sociological processes. So the fact that I, became interested in guns at this moment in time, that when I felt, insecurity, that I thought guns might be a possible response to that, that's all part of the day and age that we're living in. And, if I was living in, back in California in the 1980s and that same thing happened, I probably wouldn't have thought, oh, what would be a smart thing to do is potentially explore getting a gun. So, I think that my own personal story intersects very strongly with the story of the development of gun culture 2.0 in that way.
Professor Yamane, so as you were just mentioning, gun culture 1.0 was very much surrounded with this idea of you own a gun in the in a rural area, you go out to hunt, and the new gun culture 2.0 is much more suburban, much more urban, and the idea is more centered on self-defense. I should have either concealed carry into a supermarket, or I should be able to go to a movie theater with a gun, or such and so on, so that the idea of I can be the good guy when bad guys show a good guy with a gun to tackle the bad guy with the gun. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on the actual sociological transformation of this issue, because I can very see clearly, maybe you moved from California to North Carolina and you realize that the norm around it is much more normal and peaceful, that people carry guns. But why did we see, back from the 80s to 30, 40 years later to today, where a generation of Americans completely shifted their attitudes towards guns, even though arguably America has become safer, more developed, wealthier, and the Overton window for political discourse has even shifted towards, to become more liberal and progressive, one could say.
Yeah. So I think that one of the things about the defense-oriented gun culture is that it's potentially open to a broader demographic population. And I say potentially because, it's still the case that if you are, an older white male living in a rural area of the South, you're more likely to own guns than, if you're a younger minority woman living in an urban area in the Northeast or the West. So, that reality persists. But people who are getting into guns more recently, especially people who are more interested in defensive gun ownership, are demographically more diverse than that older model. And it makes sense in that sort of self-defense is a universal concern, whereas hunting and sport shooting is sort of more of a niche activity. And so as people become concerned for their own personal protection, again, as the culture shifts, then guns become more of an option for people. Now, to understand the shift towards gun culture 2.0, I think you have to kind of go back before the 1980s, back kind of into the 1960s, where we had, a time of tremendous social change in the United States, a lot of social unrest. And there was at the time a rising concern about the security and just a concern about the social uncertainty of the time. And I think this plants the seeds for defense-oriented gun culture, which then in the 1970s begins to flower more, and then really takes root in the 1980s when you have the legal movement for concealed carry in the United States. And I think that to bring those two kind of themes together, if we think about last year, 2020 was probably the greatest gun buying spree in the history of the United States. And what drove that gun buying spree was social uncertainty and social unrest, unlike the 1960s. And again, there were older conservative rural white men buying guns, but there were also a lot of younger people, a lot of racial minorities, a lot of women, a lot of people in urban and suburban areas who, faced with first the COVID uncertainty, then the social unrest through the summer, and then the uncertainty surrounding the presidential election. It was kind of a perfect storm of, gun buying motivations among people. And again, that sort of highlights the greater potential for inclusiveness of gun culture 2.0 than gun culture 1.0.
Yeah, we were curious about your recent blogs about what you call the great gun buying spree of 2020, right?
Yeah.
So what set are we understanding correctly that what set last year apart from other years was sort of there were more people than ever, or more people than in recent years, who were sort of brought into the defense-oriented gun culture that you mentioned. Is that basically what happened?
Yeah, but I think the last big gun buying spree in the United States came in late 2012 and 2013 after the Sandy Hook massacre. And at the time, I think that people were less concerned about personal safety, although that was still an abiding concern at the time, as they were concerned with Obama taking their guns. So, it's commonly said in the gun culture that, President Obama is the greatest gun salesman in history. But the gun sales that took place last year make, the gun sales under Obama kind of look like a joke. And the buying that was taking place last year was not because people thought someone was going to take away their guns, right? Trump was president. There was no strong movement for assault weapons ban or other things. And so, why did people buy guns in such record numbers? Because COVID hit, nobody knew what was going to happen with COVID. They didn't know whether there was going to be complete social breakdown. They didn't know whether the police were going to be negative affected by the virus. And then rolling straight from that into the George Floyd protests. Again, a lot of social uncertainty around that, a lot of social unrest. And then we rolled straight from that into this hugely contentious political campaign where, you had people on both sides, the Boogaloo Boys arming up to, to stop the steal. And then, people who were more liberal thinking that that people were going to try to have a coup and keep Trump in power. So people on all sides of the political spectrum and all demographic groups were interested in accumulating firearms last year, and that was very different than in previous gun buying sprees, and really I think connected to the idea of personal protection given the social unrest and social uncertainty.
Professor Yamane, you did mention Sandy Hook, and we also know in the past few years there has been increasing societal attention on mass shooting, whether at schools or church or domestic terrorism, white supremacist terrorism. So shouldn't that in some sense deter people of thinking the necessity of buying more guns? So that's the first part of my question. The second part is it's really interesting you brought up Obama, because it almost seems to be a feedback loop where, because there were mass shootings, the Democratic administration at the time thought we need to tighten the regulation, and that made people feel like their guns are being taken away, and they buy more guns, and then that could cause more, and it's just going downhill.
Yeah, I think that the way I look at the sort of American population relative to guns is that you've got, you know, uh, about a third of the country who are just completely bought into guns, and it doesn't matter what happens, their response is going to be, "I need more guns." Uh, there's about a third of the population who are non-gun owners and would never own guns and feel like every problem, that involves violence in the United States is a gun problem. But then you have this interesting group in the middle of about a third of the population. These are the people I call the gun curious, who, don't currently own guns, but are very open to gun ownership. And I think that's where a lot of the interesting activity takes place because those people, can, given the right social circumstances, be shifted into the gun owning side of the equation. And I think some of those people who were gun curious in 2020 kind of got off the bench. And even I would say back in after Sandy Hook, I met a number of people who were at gun shows buying AR-15 rifles in December of 2012, who didn't currently own those rifles only because they thought that they would be banned and they wouldn't be able to own them going forward. So the availability of firearms in the United States and the connection of firearms to the idea of personal protection means that anytime people feel threatened, that's an available response that I would argue up to 2/3 of the population, potentially will turn to. And so, I think that the from the perspective of, and this is, I was, for most of my life in that 1/3 who was never owned a gun and never thought I would own a gun. It's hard to comprehend why people would respond to a mass shooting by buying a gun. But from the perspective of someone who thinks that guns generally make a person more safe, or at least are a hedge against that insecurity, then it's a rational response of sorts, in at least psychologically rational. Whether it's numerically rational, I think is a somewhat different question, and that we could talk about that if you want.
Yeah, it's precisely as what you just said. Is this just a common collective action problem where for each individual it is rational to buy more guns, but the resulting phenomena of the society owning more guns is not very ideal. I think America has 400 million guns or something, more than a gun for each individual. It's crazy.
Well, so I think it's interesting because a lot of times when we look at issues of, say, gun violence, say, it's common for people to say, the homicide rate in the United States is higher than any other advanced industrial society in the world, using population as the denominator. But if you use the number of guns in the country as the denominator, we actually have a pretty low rate of violence, right? So we can sometimes think about turning that question on its head and not saying, why is there so much gun violence in the United States? We say, there are 400 million guns owned by 80 million gun owners. Why is there so little gun violence in the United States? I mean, why aren't people literally shooting each other every single day? And the nature of gun violence in the United States is, I don't mean to trivialize it at all, because if you're a victim, or if you live in a community that's victimized by gun violence, this is a terrible thing. But the gun violence in the United States is very tightly focused. Like the large majority of the violence. I mean, obviously, one of the things that is so disconcerting about mass public shootings is that, they are more seemingly random. You don't know when that's going to happen. You don't know where that's going to happen. But that's a small piece of the gun violence puzzle. The biggest piece of the gun violence puzzle, is extremely concentrated among particular social groups in particular areas. Andrew Papachristos, a sociologist, studies the networks of gun violence, and if you're involved in certain networks, your likelihood of being a victim of gun violence is much higher than if you're outside of those networks. So, I like to say that the problem with averages is that no one lives in the United States, right? We all live in particular states. We all live in particular counties. We all live in particular cities. We all live in particular neighborhoods. And when we get down to that neighborhood level, the risk of being a victim of gun violence can be extremely high. Some places like St. Louis is like Honduras, and some are really low. That if you live in Plano, Texas, which is a gun-rich area, it's, you might as well live in Switzerland in terms of the levels of gun violence that exists there. So, the United States is a huge, diverse country, and, looking at national population statistics, I think, can be kind of deceiving in that sense, because gun violence can be so localized.
I'm curious about the distinction you drew between gun buying being psychologically rational versus numerically rational. And specifically, well, because in the, starting in the 80s, there was the right to carry movement, and nearly all states by 2010 had right to carry laws. So anyone who applied for a permit, or most people who applied for a permit, could get one. And now some states are going for permitless or constitutional carry environments. I think 13 states have done so. How does the, because people want to have guns and have them visible because of the perceived physical safety. But how does the increased visibility of guns end up affecting discourse? And how does it end up affecting volatility? If there are, like what we saw in Kenosha, with Kyle Rittenhouse having a weapon and using it in a at a very inappropriate moment and in a very inappropriate environment.
Yeah. So I'd say, I would distinguish between the concealed carry movement and concealed carry laws versus open carry. And, there's a lot of division even within the gun culture about the propriety of open carry. And, there'll be people who say, look, I respect people's right to open carry. Like, I don't disagree with that they have a right to open carry, but it's stupid and it scares people and it can lead to negative outcomes. So we don't need to do that, particularly given the fact that people can legally conceal carry, in many places and at many times. So, that right to carry movement, I think that you mentioned that started in the 1980s and a little bit before that, is really a right to concealed carry, which, I think can be distinguished from, the right to open carry. And sometimes those get conflated, but in reality, for example, in North Carolina, it's never been illegal to openly carry a firearm. It used to be that if you were an honorable person, you would in fact openly carry your firearm, and only criminals tried to conceal their firearms. And so we've seen an interesting reversal now, where people think it's probably better to carry concealed. So, I think that's a long way of saying, that open carry is something that not even the sort of majority of people that I know within gun culture 2.0 advocate people doing, whereas concealed carry, is much more universally recognized as something that people can and should do. Now, the question of the psychologically rational versus the, I don't know if we say actually or empirically rational, or what the right way to talk about that is, that I think guns make people feel safer, right? People who have guns, it makes people who don't have guns feel less safe. That's a separate issue. But people who own guns, it makes them feel safer. And, I think that sense of security, psychological security, is nothing that we should sort of minimize, right? It's important for people to have a sense of psychological security. Now, whether guns make a person actually more secure, I think becomes a more difficult question, right? Like, if you are in an abusive relationship, or if you're an alcoholic, or if you have a history of depression in your family, right? There are any number of different conditions under which you might think that having a gun is going to make you safer, but actually might make you less safe. And we know that, for all the talk about gun homicides, that 2/3 of all gun deaths are the result of suicide. So, I think that when we talk about, do guns actually make people safer, on the one hand, I want to steer away from this notion that, every gun makes a person less safe, and towards something that says, let's look at the conditions under which owning a gun would make someone more safe versus less safe.
Yeah, because how often do maybe defense-oriented gun owners actually use their firearm lethally? Are they just confident because they have it, or are they confident because they know they can use it and are intend to if they need to?
Yeah. Well, this is an area of research that's a big mess. There's been debates over the number of defensive gun uses there are in the United States, all the way from people saying it's, 50,000 a year, all the way up to millions a year. And some of that has to do with, definitions, because from the perspective of gun culture, you don't actually need to discharge your firearm in order to successfully defend yourself with a gun. You may just have to let the person know you have it. You may just have to brandish it. And so, there's the number of defensive gun uses in the United States in any given year is substantial, I would say, and without trying to quantify that number. But I think, again, from the perspective of defensive gun culture, it's not simply a matter of I have the gun and I can or will use it, but there's a whole kind of mindset that changes, that affects a person's behavior, how they navigate through the world. And I think that most people who concealed carry aren't sitting looking for an excuse to use their gun. It's not like a Dirty Harry, go ahead, make my day kind of situation, but they're, actively seeking to avoid, situations in which they may have to use, a gun to defend themselves, because there are huge, psychological, economic, social costs to using a firearm in self-defense. So it is a sort of tool of last resort, in that way. And, I think sometimes people who are against concealed carry sort of say, oh, very few people ever who concealed carry ever use their guns, so concealed carry isn't necessary, versus an approach that says, thank goodness very few people who concealed carry ever have to use their guns. But for the people who do, they really needed it at that moment.
Professor Yamane, you remind me when I was talking to a political theory professor who studies political theory of money, and he was saying about fiat currency. He said people focus a lot about all the crashes we've had, but the fact that we can just print money all day and have so few crashes over the past few centuries is quite amazing. So it kind of reminds me of what you said. But I guess the question is, it seems to me that the research, the empirical research on whether you owning a gun at your home makes you actually safer is a little bit unclear. So we always hear the liberal kind of parody of the situation, which is that, okay, you have a gun, where do you put it? Do you put it in the safe or do you put it on your table? Because if you put it in your safe, when the robber actually comes in, you don't have time to actually go unlock the safe and shoot him. But then if you have it on the table, what if your child just does it? So it seems to me, just to make sure I understand correctly, empirically saying it's very hard to say whether it actually makes a difference.
Yeah. Yeah, and they say, there's been studies very, very commonly cited that say, for example, if you have a gun in your home, you're 2.6 times more likely to be a homicide victim than if you don't have a gun in your home. But that, simple statistic needs to be unpacked in so many different ways. For example, that doesn't mean that you're 2.6 times more likely to be killed in your home, or to be killed with your own gun in your home. Most of those people who have guns in their homes are killed outside of their homes by somebody else's gun, right? Which may sort of lead to people thinking, well, what else is going on there? Because then, we also know that people, that having an arrest record dramatically increases your likelihood of being a homicide victim. Having a history of drug and alcohol abuse. When I first read that study, I was living in an apartment for the first time in a long time, and not owning your own home makes you 5 times more likely to be a homicide victim. And I was sitting there thinking, great, now I'm living in a rented unit here, so does that make me 5 times more likely to be a homicide victim? And by design, these kind of multivariate statistical studies sort of pull variables apart to try to isolate the causal influence of the variables independent of one another. But in reality, we're kind of holistic people, right? So perhaps having a gun in your home makes you somewhat more likely to be a homicide victim. But if you own your own home and you're not a drug addict and you haven't been in an abusive relationship before and you don't have a criminal record, then you're less likely to be a homicide victim, even if you have a gun in your home. Right. So, I think that's one of the ways that those statistics kind of create some frustration for me, because it's easy for people who want to engage the issue from a political perspective just to say that gun in the home, 3 times more likely to be a homicide victim. But that's just the starting point, right? That's not a conclusion.
I'm curious about the work you've done about reactions to gun violence in churches. How do congregation leaders, how do worshipers who might, well, maybe this connects to what you were saying about feeling safety in your home. They might feel safety in a religious community. I think you call it the body armor of Christ.
Mm.
How do they react to that gun violence in their religious spaces?
Yeah. Well, I think, this is kind of like taking those individual level responses I was talking about up to kind of the organizational level, and if people don't have any experience with guns, they're more likely to see guns as dangerous, and they're not likely to respond to, uncertainty by looking at guns as a solution. Whereas if you have experience with guns, you're likely to see them more as protective and to respond to uncertainty by looking to guns to make you more secure. I think this happens at the organizational level as well. So religious congregations that tend to be from sort of more politically, I'd say theologically and politically conservative backgrounds, are much more comfortable with an armed response to security threats, whereas congregations that are from more sort of theologically liberal and politically liberal um, traditions are less likely to look at armed responses. But even there, I think that you see some overlap. You see some Jewish synagogues who think we might need armed security to protect ourselves. They just would look to hiring professional security as opposed to say a more theologically conservative Southern Baptist congregation who might say, hey, everybody bring your guns to church Sunday, right? So, a lot of times I think that people who are personally or organizationally um, uneasy with guns will oftentimes just outsource the guns to other people, right? So it's not like if someone's breaking into my home, it's not like I don't want an armed response to that. I just want to pick up my phone and call someone who has a gun to come and deal with the problem, as opposed to my dealing with the problem myself. So, I think even people who are, obviously there's some people who want to disarm the police as well and, not have a military. But I think your average American non-gun owner, wants the police to have guns and for us to be able to call them when we need them, in the same way that they want to be able to call someone to clean their house when it's time to clean their house and mow the lawn when it's time to mow their lawn.
I'm interested, this might be a little bit off the topic of guns and more towards your background in religion. I'm interested that you mentioned not only politically conservative or liberal, but also theologically conservative or liberal. What does theology have to do with being comfortable with guns?
Yeah. So, I think that, theological conservatism is a big sort of topic, but, one of the things that, at least say within the Christian tradition that I know best, people who are theologically conservative, tend to see the world as somewhat more as, let's say, fallen, perhaps might be a way to describe it, or they recognize more the presence of evil in the world. And if you see the world as more fallen with and more imbued with evil or evil spirits, then you're just much more comfortable with the idea that those things need to be actively resisted or even actively fought against. Whereas if theological liberals tend to see the world in somewhat more benign ways, they tend to see human nature as somewhat more benign. And so, I think the notion that, forces of evil need to be resisted actively are less common among those theological liberals. So, the notion that when you're, in your congregation, that something bad could happen and you just need to be prepared for it, and that's how the world is, that more characterizes, I think, the theologically conservative or traditional congregations.
I guess another environment where we see sort of an unexpected violence is schools, and but schools they don't have that sort of theological, maybe also the community component. How what are reactions to gun violence in schools, and how are they different? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think here we again see the importance of sort of ideological perspectives on what the proper way to respond to these things are. So, I think in areas that are more politically conservative, that you see the notion of needing to have an on-the-spot armed response as more popular, whether that is having sort of armed resource officers or arming teachers, arming principals, whereas places that are, I think, more politically liberal, less comfortable with guns, think that they don't think bringing more guns into schools is a good response to school violence. So I think, a lot of our political responses to, how do we solve problems that have to do with guns are really fundamentally shaped by how do we feel about guns in the first place. And how we feel about guns in the first place can be profoundly shaped simply by our own personal experience with guns. The people who have more experience with guns in their childhood or in their daily life are much more, they think of guns as less dangerous. They're much more comfortable with having guns around or potentially using guns, whereas people who don't have that same experience with guns, either in their childhood or in the among their friends, tend to see any introduction of guns into a situation as just making that situation more dangerous, right? And that, again, you can see how that could build up to in a religious congregation, in a school, in a workplace, all the way up to our national politics, and whether we should make guns harder to get and use or make guns easier to get and use.
Professor Yamane, I'm pretty impressed by, I would say, inspired by this sentence you just said, which is that policy responses seem to be largely dependent on people's own lived experiences, which stem from their own upbringing, culture, communities. So in that sense, because of the sociology of guns that we've seen in America, it's almost impossible, it seems to me, to regulate guns or push for legislations that are based on scientific research per se. So you would never be able to convince someone from a conservative state that taking the gun away from you is actually going to make you safer. Let's even say that there is studies that will show that actually, that everybody agrees on, all experts agree on. You'll still not be able to do that because it's so shaped fundamentally by ideology, lived experiences, and culture.
Yeah. And I think, we see this in sort of the cultural cognition perspective. Some people at Yale Law School, Kahan and Brahman, talk about this, building on the work of the anthropologist Mary Douglas, all the way to more psychological perspectives like Jonathan Haidt's work on the righteous mind. The notion that human beings are basically rational information processors is probably a fundamentally, misunderstanding the way that human beings sort of navigate through the world and understand things. So yeah, I mean, I think that it would be hard to think of a an research finding that would be so powerful that it could overrun people's sort of experiential understanding of um, of how the world works or what the right thing to do is in the world. But I think on the other hand, and Haidt makes this point that diversity of opinion, may help us get closer to the truth, right? So, if we could have people coming from different perspectives trying to look at and talk about the same thing, then we might advance collectively together. So, if you come to me and you say, wow, if you have a gun in your home, you're 2.6 times more likely to be a homicide victim, and then I could share some of my understanding of what that means, and then you could ask me some more questions. I could try to understand how you're seeing that, that through that those differences of opinion, we can move forward more than, you coming into, the legislature and saying we need to have an assault weapons ban because 2.6 times more likely to be a homicide victim if you have a gun in your home.
I know you are not a public policy professor, but a sociology professor, but I would still love to hear your general thoughts on policy because during the, I think, 2020 Democratic presidential primary, politician Beto O'Rourke very famously said, like, how is we're going to take your AR-15, on the debate stage. And some people applauded that. Some people said that that's just a horrible way of unifying the country. And on the other side, we see is recently elected Congresswoman Lauren Boebert, who is this Colorado Congresswoman, who basically says she will carry her pistol into the Capitol building. So we see this almost very polarizing views, probably more extreme views than before on people's stance on what guns what role guns should play in our society. So do you have any insights to these two politicians' behaviors? What are your thoughts on them?
Yeah. Well, I think that people are increasingly discovering that, and actually I can show, I was just reading to review this book called The Gun Gap by Mark Joslin, who's a political science at Kansas. And he begins by talking about how in the 2016 presidential election, the gap between how gun owners voted and how non-gun owners voted was 31 percentage points, is the biggest gun gap in measurable history, and the gap between gun owners and non-gun owners is the same as or exceeds some other gaps that political scientists spend much more time looking at, like race, gender, social class. And so the political differences between people who own guns and people who don't own guns are considerable and merit further investigation. And you could almost take O'Rourke and Boebert as being emblematic of those, that gun gap, right? Do you think that, again, having more guns makes us better off and safer, or does having fewer guns make us better off and safer? And so that creates a challenging situation to make progress on the gun issue, because in order for us to collectively sort of move forward, we can't have these massive divides between people, right? But how do you get beyond such a massive divide? Well, I mean, I would probably be teaching at Princeton if I could give an answer to that.
But in general, in terms of the very bird's eye view of policy, which part of the spectrum would you fall under? Would you still say, I agree with tougher background checks, gun sale, those gun fairs, ID checks, trainings, all that stuff? Because we always watch those small videos from Vox or other left-wing media sources that says, look at in this country like Switzerland or something else, I forgot, European countries where they have mandatory training for people who use guns, and it's much safer environment, all that stuff. So where do you think it should be the sensible line of policy?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I find myself kind of becoming, the more, it's the libertarian side of my liberalism tends to come out a little bit more when I think about these issues, because I'm not certain that government regulation of gun training would yield a very good quality of gun training. In the same way that government regulation of your ability to get a driver's license doesn't do much to make you a very good driver. It's kind of a minimum standard that very few people don't pass. And that's I think concealed carry is in a lot of the shall issue states, right? There's a minimum standard that they want people to pass and make it very easy for people to be able to get concealed carry licenses. And that I think that's probably an appropriate role for government in that, because the government doesn't know anything about how to teach people to use firearms well. And so, having said that, I do think that it's incumbent upon, gun owners to be extremely responsible with their firearms, to store them as safely as they can, to know how to use them safely, to ensure that nobody who's unauthorized gets access to them, whether it's a child, a distressed family member, a criminal. And so I think there's a lot of things that can and are promoted within the gun culture that can make us safer with firearms. That we have to figure out ways of living safely with firearms. And again, experientially, tens of millions of firearms owners every year never shoot themselves or somebody else with their guns, that in an unintentional way. So, in a certain way, we have figured out ways of living safely with guns, if only we could do it a little bit better, right? But again, it's hard to know how to reach out to you know most people who are shot and killed with guns are shot and killed intentionally, right? Whereas things like automobile deaths, those are almost all accidental, right? So how do you intervene in a situation where someone is intentionally trying to harm themselves or someone else with a firearm, right? That's not necessarily something that can be legislated at the state or even at the federal level, right? It's already against the law to harm someone else with a firearm, right? And suicide is a really kind of challenging, different sort of story. Like, people are very bent on doing harm to themselves. It may be hard to intervene in that. Although I should say that there are some groups within gun culture who are actively trying to work on reducing suicide, because it affects people within the community.
One of your points is that it's difficult for people outside of gun culture to understand the mindset inside of gun culture. And so, if I'm not mistaken, you take your sociology of guns class every year to a shooting range. Is that right?
Yeah, as the before we even meet as a class in the classroom, we go typically to a gun store and range where they get some education on different types of guns, mechanisms, and gun safety, and then they have the opportunity to shoot on the range if they want to.
And so, how do you see discourse on guns changing if more people could come to understand that? Because, well, the most publicized examples of gun use are, when it goes wrong, when there's a death, when there's an injury, and that's the most those are sensationalized almost. But how would discourse change if more people could come to understand that one can be a responsible gun owner, and if more people had the experience like your students have in class.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should always like to say up front that I don't take the students to the range to try to convert them into gun owners. I take them because I feel like having that experiential understanding of what it feels like to shoot a gun, is important as we move forward to talk about sort of gun culture and other aspects of guns and social life. But one of the biggest things I see among my students, particularly, well, the students who are familiar with guns and are like guns, they just have a good time. But usually about 2/3 of the students don't have much experience with guns, and many of those have serious reservations about the role of guns in society. And what I notice among those students is almost a visceral cognitive dissonance, because they come into it thinking guns are bad, guns are dangerous, guns hurt people, and then in the experience of shooting the guns they feel like, oh, this is fun, this is challenging to try to make the hole in the paper where they're pointing the gun at, or wow, this feels very powerful, right? I feel empowered by the fact that I can use this dangerous weapon, right? I feel responsible because of that. And so they're working out in their minds their sort of prior dislike of firearms with this feeling of this isn't so bad, right? And some of them, it's like, they talk about in their reflection papers about how they're trying to actively resist enjoying shooting the gun. And so, I think putting that people in that position where they have that dissonance gives them the foundation for learning, right? Because you try to help people work out their understanding of that experience and why they have that experience and why they come in with certain assumptions. And it doesn't fundamentally change people's orientations. I think that these orientations towards guns, risk, danger, are really, really deeply ingrained in us, both sort of psychologically and culturally. But it does soften people, I think, around the edges. That people can, even if they don't say, I would like to own guns myself, or I feel like it should be easier to get guns, they can understand why someone might take that position, right? Someone might enjoy shooting guns or owning guns, or why someone might feel, guns make them feel safer, or why people, would take the kind of political positions they do with respect to guns. And again, I think that softening, creates a condition under which people can talk about an issue that people on both sides care about. And we come through those classes, I think with a better understanding of different positions, positions different than our own, even if our positions don't change ourselves. And I think that's important.
Apart from going to handling a gun, is there any other advice maybe you would give to college students? Because college campuses, always are predominantly skewed left, and there's a lot of resistance to guns. Like you were saying, those sort of the assumptions you come into school with, culture that are culturally ingrained. What sort of advice would you inject into the conversation? And do you think a lot of the opinions of college students are maybe naive or misinformed?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I college students are supposed to, have limited understanding of things because, you have limited experiences. And I think one of the things about a liberal education is that it liberates us from the binds of our limited experiences and backgrounds. So, whether that is learning about people from another part of the world, learning a different aspect of history, learning from a diverse group of fellow students, all of those things can help liberate our minds from, the bondage of our own past and experiences. And so I think with it, same thing, with guns, if you don't have any, experience of or understanding of guns or what would make them attractive to people, then, make a concerted effort to go out and to meet people and to understand, people who, are gun owners. And I think, I encourage the people, I mean, I have to encourage them less, but people who are kind of pro-gun or gun owners who end up in college are in the minority anyway, as you said. So they're exposed to other people's views, a lot more easily. But I encourage that too, to say, you know, don't, don't just say, Beto O'Rourke is just a gun grabbing liberal. Try to understand, like, where does that come from? Where does that sense of we need to get these things out of our society, where does that come from? And take your fellow citizens, sincerely held beliefs seriously, even if you disagree with them, which, I think is one of the sad things about our contemporary politics is that seems to be harder and harder to do.
Professor Yamane, before we gradually wrap up the interview, I think would be nice to touch on a little bit of maybe philosophy or political theory before we go, because in your Gun Culture 2.0 website on the front page, you said that your approach to gun culture 2.0 is inspired by a quote from philosopher Spinoza, which is, I have sedulously endeavored not to laugh at human actions, nor to lament them, nor to detest them, but to understand them. And I guess this goes back to what you were just saying. So we talked a lot about sociology today. Are there other political theorists or philosophers that you think may have inspired you a lot, whose political philosophy you identify with and you think would be nice for our listeners to know about? Because I remember earlier in the interview, you were talking about the libertarian side of liberalism from you. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would really be getting out of my depth to try to recommend, political theorists or philosophers to try to look at to understand this. That quote from Spinoza actually was given to me by one of my faculty members who was a social theorist, an empirical sociologist as well, Reinhard Bendix. And he, really kind of conveyed to us the importance of bracketing our own personal judgments as a way of getting out and understanding the world better, right? And so, I think there are differences within sociology, within political science. All the social science is now about what role our values should play in the work we do. And some, the idea of the scholar activist, that there's no difference between my scholarly work and my political activities, that has a lot of currency now. It's had a lot of currency probably since the 1960s, maybe even all the way, back to Marx, who said the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways, but the point is to change it. But I think there's the stream of social science, which I feel more comfortable working within, is that stream that says, in the first instance, we have to understand the world and understand how the world works. And if we're too caught up in judging the world or trying to correct the world, that could impede our ability to understand it. So, for me, understanding first, which isn't to say that, it's not a form of sort of cultural relativism. I mean, I think after engaging in empirical study, we can judge something as being better or worse. But if we go in with too strong of a sense of better or worse, it can affect our ability to understand. So, I mean, I think that's probably some sort of philosophical position, but I think that my approach really is to try to understand what's happening on the ground, and leave the ontological navel gazing to people in the philosophy department.
Professor Yamane, I'm a big fan of your work and what you're doing right now, but I also feel like, don't you think it's a little bit unrealistic to or idealistic to expect most Americans to do what you're doing, which is to keep an open mind and actually understand things and update their beliefs based on truly understanding the other side's lived experiences and empirical evidence? Especially, I mean, we were just talking about how 2020 saw a huge gun buying spree, and associated, we also saw people buying, I don't know, Bitcoin or things like that, where we literally see the public, the mass, no longer feel like the expert class should tell them what they have to do, right? And we don't even have to go into gun regulation. Even something as simple as mask wearing, a lot of the people in the country see that as something that is limiting their freedom and liberty, and that is something completely manufactured by the expert class to curtail their freedom, which, as irrational as we may think it is not irrational to them. And it seems that it is very hard to push for any sensible reasoning in today's day and age.
Yeah. And I feel like I oftentimes kind of get it from both sides, because, from, people who are more on the anti-gun side, they just want to kind of pound and more regulation. Nothing good comes of guns. Look at England and Australia, et cetera, et cetera. But then, from the other side, there are people who, are just so committed to their own positions, that are pro-gun positions, that they don't really care what I have to say either, right? So, I think if the question for me becomes, is that middle ground, broad and deep, or is it shallow and thin? And I like to think that it's broader and deeper than we may think, because a lot of public discourse gets dominated by people on the wings, right? We can't help but hear from Lauren Boebert and Beto O'Rourke, but where is the mass of the population at? Is it in some more uh, openness to understanding? And I think that's, this day and age, it's hard to be optimistic about that. But as people tell me, I'm more optimistic than a lot of people, and so I feel like we can keep hammering away at this. Although I have to admit, I haven't finished reading Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, so I don't know whether there is any hope for us. I mean, it may be that our fundamental ways of understanding the world are so rigidly set in our early histories that there is no hope.
So
But let's not conclude on that note. We have to find some other note to conclude on.
So what would be the optimistic path you think we could go towards? So ideally, what should politicians do? What should the media do? What should scholars do? What should the people do?
Yeah. I mean, I think that everybody needs to try to understand people who are coming from a different place than them better. And I feel like, given my 42 years of life, completely outside of guns and gun culture, and my 10 years of life inside of that, that I have kind of a foot in both, and that, I can do some translation. I feel like it's one of the things I try to do, is adapting my scholarly work to broader audiences is to try to interpret each side to the other. And if more people were opening to listening, and having people who could act as translators, I think that we would be better off, because I think they're like, nobody who's either pro-gun or anti-gun is like pro-homicide or pro-suicide. That everybody finds those things to be negative, and the question is just, how can we come together to find some sort of common ground from which we can fight against those things. And there are, again, small areas of optimism on those fronts, and hopefully those continue to grow, and hopefully and as the pendulum swings back and forth, maybe we've gone to the far end of polarization, and the pendulum will start to swing back more towards some common ground. If it continues towards polarization, I'm just fortunate that I'm more than halfway done with my life, and I'll just leave it to your generation to live with the consequences of that.
Exactly. That's what I think all the time as well. So how can people learn more about your work? And also, we always at the end ask our show to conclude with a policy punchline, since that's the name of our show. So what would your punchline be? Maybe much more optimistic. So.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned my two blogs, Gun Culture 2.0, and also Gun Curious. I try to post on both of those regularly, and you can also link to some of my more academic work, from both of those sites. And my policy punchline, this part you may have to edit out, because it's like,
it doesn't have to be even about policy. It doesn't have to be punchy at all. Anything.
It doesn't have to be policy or punchy. Then how is it even called a policy punchline?
the name. So our show has evolved in such a way such that punchline implies something short and witty, but we do long form podcasting that lasts an hour and a half, 2 hours. So it's completely antithetical to punchline, and we've broadened our scope beyond policy. I mean, we talked about sociology today. We have philosophers on the show all the time, so it's definitely not policy nor punchline anymore. So
okay, I mean, I'd say this is also stealing from my blog, is just light over heat. The gun debates are so heated in our society that it impedes our ability to understand guns and understand each other. So I think if people look for light, either in understanding the world as social scientists, or try to find the light in those people with whom we disagree, I think the world would be a better place.
Professor Yamane, thank you so much for joining us today. This is just a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks very much for having me.
And Sebastian, thanks so much for doing this interview with me. I hope you enjoyed your first ever Policy Punchline interview. So, yeah.
Certainly did, Tiger, and thank you, Professor Yamani, for being on the show.
Well, and this concludes this episode of Policy Punchline. You may follow us on policypunchline.com, iTunes, Spotify. You can watch the YouTube video. You can also follow Professor Yamane's work. He also has a book upcoming about gun culture 2.0. His two blogs are Gun Culture 2.0 and Gun Curious. This concludes this episode. We'll see you next time.